Well, good morning, everyone. Hearing on Committee of Agriculture entitled Cryptocurrencies, Oversight of New Assets in the Digital Age will come to order. Well, good morning. We've got a terrific panel this
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second version of If Tone Vays Spoke in front of the Senate Hearing Committee. I really thought that the first time I did this video, it came out really good. So I wanted to cover the second Senate hearings that took place in front of the Agriculture Committee. So I know I've been having some sound and audio issues, so hopefully that won't be the case here. Thank you so much for watching. I will try to answer the congressman's questions about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin as they were asking them during the hearings, just like we did the first version with the Financial Services Committee. So without further ado, I'm going to go back to screen share and let's get going.
This morning, I see a lot of new faces as in the audience today. One of the big questions on a lot of folks' minds is what's the Agriculture Committee doing with cryptocurrency and the distributed ledger technology? But we're here to find that out this morning. So for those of you that have not joined us before, welcome. We're happy to have you as we discuss an emerging policy area that is of deep interest to our members, to the emerging crypto industry, and we hope to all Americans of all stripes. Digital assets like Bitcoin and Ether, but also hundreds of other token-based projects that are being developed represent a new way for people to interact and exchange in commerce with one another. While digital assets are often thought of as payment systems or digital gold, I believe the promise that token networks hold is more universal and more exciting, quite frankly, than that. For the first time, we have a tool that enables individuals to reliably exchange value in a digital realm without an intermediary. We can have assets that exist, can be created, exchanged, consumed in digital form. The promise of being able to secure property rights in digital space may fundamentally change how people interact with one another. This technology holds the potential to bring enormous benefits to each of us if we're willing to give it the space to grow. Providing a strong, clear legal regulatory framework for digital assets is essential. To that end, there are several questions before us about how laws should govern the issuance, trade, and utilization of these digital assets. Perhaps no question has generated greater uncertainty than how to determine if a particular token is a security. We generally know what to do if a commonly traded asset is in fact deemed a security. We simply apply the securities laws. If it's not a security, there's a good chance it's a commodity, which will be subject to the requirements of the Commodity Exchange Act. The problem seems to be in making that determination. The Howey test, which concerns the sale of orange groves and service contracts from the 1940s, is often presented as a standard test to determine if the securities laws govern a token, yet they proved to be challenging in the analysis under this test. A related question is whether or not current laws are appropriate for these new digital assets. If a token is determined to be a security or a commodity or something else, our regulatory regime need not be static. If it's necessary, Congress or regulators may want to consider developing a new framework that takes into account the diverse characteristics and unique economic relationships embedded in many of the types of digital assets that can be represented by tokens. Providing clear guidance to enable developers to determine the nature of their token and then suitable rules to enable them to develop their project is essential to both protecting the public and promoting innovation. How we regulate these products and those who develop them won't determine if they're developed or used, but it will determine where they're developed and used. And we want that innovation done in our country. As we consider changes to the laws or new regulations, the Committee on Agriculture will be part of that conversation. Within the House, we have a vested interest in the definition of a security because it directly impacts the definition of a commodity. Similar to our work in agriculture commodities as well as futures and swaps markets, the committee has a strong interest in promoting safe, efficient, transparent markets for those who use these new token markets. Properly regulated markets promote innovation and foster economic growth, and I don't believe that it will be any different with respect to digital assets. Of course, proper regulation does not mean intrusive regulation. It means regulation appropriate to the nature of the activities and the participants, and in some cases, it might mean no regulation at all. Before I turn to ranking member, I want to thank all of our witnesses for making time to prepare and testify. We have an incredibly qualified panel to present all sides of a fascinating and complex set of issues. I welcome to please each one of you here today for this conversation And with that, Donald, I'll turn to you for any comments that you might want to have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for joining us here today. And I'm happy that we have a chance to review this new technology. And our role is to oversee the CFTC regulation of it, if that's appropriate. As a CPA and someone who spent a career helping folks run numbers on their finances, I still am having a hard time getting my hands around this, and I have some real concerns. One trait of cryptocurrency that we need to pay special attention to is its volatility. There are some of you that will tell us that the fluctuations in cryptocurrency are a good thing and part of its appeal. But the increased speculation and the fact that regular investors stand to lose their shirts gives me a great deal of concern. As one study found, over 80% of the initial coin offerings are scams. While regular investors stand to lose a very small amount, stand to gain. For example, 97% of Bitcoin is held by just 4% of the participants in cryptocurrency. There's a lot of things here that don't make much sense to me. And who knows, maybe some type of this technology will come along and really make a difference after these starts and fits. But as it stands right now, I'm skeptical. It's our job to be the adults in the room and to ensure that in these early days, there's enough oversight of this new frontier to ensure that it can grow responsibly. With that, I look forward to your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. So, Chair would request other members submit their opening statements for the record so that our witnesses may begin their testimony and to ensure there's ample time for questions. I'd now like to.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this committee, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Peterson. And the first thing I would like to say is, like you said in your opening statement, there's a lot of confusion between Bitcoin and Ethereum. They are very, very different. And by just first saying that, I would like to add that I break down the cryptocurrency space into 4 different parts. One of those parts is standalone Bitcoin. This was the innovation by Satoshi Nakamoto by solving the double spend or the Byzantine general problem, and basically a way to send digital data in a finite way so that you're losing the possession of that digital data. Unlike the emails, the text messages, the Word documents, even like audio or video files that people share around the internet, with Bitcoin, once you send that digital data, you actually lose possession of that data. The only way that was able to be achieved is with the concept known as proof of work, which does involve a lot of mining and the burning of electricity and removes all third parties from the transfer of that, digital data. So for me, that is category 1. So Bitcoin was the first to do that. It maintains the best developers, the most qualified people that continue to innovate and hopefully take us a lot further to make Bitcoin a lot more useful from many different realms. That's category 1. Category 2 is Bitcoin copycats. These are people that simply took the idea of Bitcoin in the early days, changed a couple of parameters, and made things a little bit different, and then relaunched in a very similar way that Bitcoin did. 2 very notable examples of this are Litecoin and Monero. They simply slightly changed the way the math formulas are done, but they were also launched in a way that was fair. Everyone had a chance to continuously mine and discover more of that digital asset. They just have slightly different parameters. I believe that these, while at the moment, they're still looked at as being somewhat useful, but mostly used for just speculative purposes. And I believe that the free market will eventually render those tokens useless. The third category is also similar in that they are also proof of work coins, in that you have to burn something and spend things like electricity and buying hardware in order to create more of the coin and create more security of that coin. However, those tokens were created for the sole purpose of either one person or a couple of people getting rich on the fact of launching those currencies. So two notable examples in that realm are Zcash and Dash, formerly Darkcoin, formerly Xcoin, and changing the branding, changing the names go along with that to kind of mask the original creation of the asset. For example, in the case of Zcash, it was a for-profit company basically creating it where they get to keep 20% of all of the freshly created tokens or currencies or whatever you will eventually classify it as. And that's basically the third class of coins. The fourth class of coins is the majority of the current market cap of all the crypto space. And this is completely regulatable. And this is the ICO and the proof of stake side of the coins. So these are all the coins that are masking as securities, which we will get into throughout these hearings. So either ICOs or proof of stake coins, where you're not actually spending anything, no electricity is being burned, no effort is being put in to create more of the asset. Simply holding the asset earns you a lot more of the asset. I see these as basically a way to get around all of the current security laws and all the other laws, which this hearing would be absolutely perfect for. Some notable examples in that space, Ethereum covers several sides of this, especially if they do eventually switch to from proof of work and the burning of electricity to a proof of stake model. They will cover both ends. Ethereum wasn't the first, but it's the most notable. Mastercoin was the first. They have rebranded to Omni. Again, a lot of the rebranding names are done to mask the original history of what actually happened. And all of the ICOs that the governments are currently dealing with and a lot of the investors, they all fall into this fourth realm. So understanding the difference between the four types of crypto assets is very, very important if you are to understand where cryptocurrency is going in the future. I'll leave it here and I look forward to answering your questions.
Welcome our witnesses to our table. Everybody have 5 minutes to pitch your wares, and we've also got your opening statement, or your full statements for the record. So with that, Mr. Gisler, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Conaway, Ranking Member Peterson. My condolences on your dad's passing. It's good to be with you all here today. I think I've testified in front of you a dozen or 2 dozen times in some previous capacities. But since I was last with you, I took on a new role at MIT where I am engaged, yes, in researching, teaching, lecturing, and advising on digital currency and blockchain technology. Now I say that, but for those who don't know, because some are new, I also chaired the Commodity Futures Trading Commission for 4 or 5 years. And before that, long ago, I was 18 years at Goldman Sachs. So I bring from my years in finance, my years in public policy, and now, I guess as an academic, some perspective of what I've learned. And with the chair's permission, one thing I've learned as an academic is to ask the audience a little bit about their engagement in Bitcoin. So again, with the chair's permission, if I could just ask, how many members of this committee have invested in cryptocurrencies? And I'm going to ask the audience too. So we've got one in the audience.
All right, Bob.
Hands.
Several in the audience.
Yeah, we got about half the audience. It's an interesting split. There we go. I would say the other thing that splits the community in my discussions usually is, this is not a community that splits normally like right and left, Republican, Democrat. This is a community that splits more about Bitcoin maximalist and Bitcoin pessimist, or skeptics on one end. And by the way, some of those skeptics and pessimists are Republican and some are Democrat. Some are Nobel laureates, some are in finance, whether it's Jamie Dimon or Warren Buffett. And then some of the maximalists can be in venture capitalists like in Andreessen Horowitz and elsewhere. So it's interesting, the split in the community. I'm probably a little bit center maximalist, if I can say that. I'm an optimist on the underlying technology. You'll also hear some people say, well, not that Bitcoin, but the blockchain technology is good. And they kind of split their their views that way. So again, what have I learned? Blockchain technology, I believe, has a real potential to transform the world of finance because it is about money. It's about moving value on the internet. This new technology could lower costs and risk in the financial sector. Second, to reach its potential, I feel strongly that, and for public confidence, to reach its potential, we need to bring it inside the world that we know, the long-held public policy frameworks. So what are those frameworks? Congress has a role to play to tinker about these frameworks. But I'm just saying, what are our historical frameworks about technology and finance? We guard against illicit activity like tax evasion or money laundering. We ensure for financial stability, and we protect investors and consumers. Those are the three big ones. We protect against illicit activity, we ensure for financial stability, and we protect investors. Everything else is debatable, and we need to adjust the details underneath that. Third, the SEC and CFTC do have a role to play. Both of them have roles to play. They've released numerous notices and enforcement actions and so forth. However, there's a lot of non-compliance. I mean, there are thousands of entrepreneurs out there that probably right now are not complying with SEC guidance. And there are fewer that are not complying with CFTC guidance, but that's just because the CFTC doesn't have oversight of this thing called the initial coin offering market. And that's where there's a lot going on. And this thing's going large and big. It's about a $250 billion market. $250 billion is getting some size. I mean, the overall capital markets in the world are about 250 trillion or 300 trillion, so it's not threatening that. But thousands of ICOs have been raised, $20 billion of capital formation. I'm here to say nearly all of them, I don't know if it's 98% or 97%, but nearly all of them are probably securities under our securities laws because they're being offered in a pre-functional time. This ICO market's rife with scams and frauds. Fourth, bad actors have figured out how to use this new currency. Sometimes it's state actors. We learned last Friday it was the alleged, I should say, but the alleged 12 Russian spies. Venezuela tries to raise it off of their oil and outrun U.S. sanctions policy. Fifth, while federal agencies are engaged, current laws apply to this activity. There are gaps. So if I can mention a few of the gaps. First, I think that there's gaps around the crypto exchanges themselves, either where you can buy and sell. Why? Because they're being right now regulated through state money transmission laws. This approach, regulating them like Western Union or MoneyGram, is just not satisfactory because crypto activity is more complex and it's harder to trace, and it doesn't build on top of the traditional banking system. It's built on something that we can't see that's out there in other countries like in China and Russia. So second, the crypto exchanges lack brokered access. They don't have brokers. So there's no brokers, by the way, sending 1099-Bs, and my detailed testimony says, you know, maybe the IRS should do something about that so you can just have reporting of the gains. Third, the issuers of securities, the crypto space, are only slowly coming into the SEC remit. I think this is going to take 2, 3, 4 years before the SEC really cleans up the space. And so there's going to be a lot of call on, can they go faster? Can we do it right? But it's going to take some time. Fourth, crypto derivatives are being handled by the CFTC. I think they're doing it well, but there's two things that worry me about the technology. And one is that the unregulated underlying crypto cash market is a mess. So the corn and wheat markets that you oversee, the gold and the oil markets, we have a lot of history. We have some confidence about that. And then the CFTC can do their job layering over those underlying commodities. The CFTC is regulating derivatives, but they're referencing an underlying market where it's just, at best, the Wild West, and at worst, it's pretty bad. So about that underlying market, the CFTC has general anti-fraud and anti-manipulation authorities with regard to it, but I think that Congress will be debating it. Probably not in this Congress, but I suspect in the next session, the next Congress, you all will be debating, should you give the CFTC additional authority, or maybe some other agency, you know, maybe it would be the SEC, somebody else. But I think the CFTC to have additional authorities about that underlying what I would call cash crypto market, it's 70% of the market. The SEC has securities, the CFTC had derivatives. I think you'll want to debate whether to do something about the underlying market. And lastly, I think you'll need to give them resources along with your friends over at the Appropriations Committee, because I think these agencies will need that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Gensler. That's myself.
I left Gary Gensler's opening 5 minutes as the only opening 5 minutes of the panel. I felt that Mr. Gensler had the most critical things to say. I felt that his answers throughout the entire hearings were most useful, as opposed to the other people speaking in front of Congress. And there will be a couple of answers by all the members, maybe not all the members, but there will be a couple of answers by the panelists that I left in this video. And Gary Gensler's were certainly the ones worth listening to the most. So I do recommend watching the entire hearings, perhaps, and be very careful listening to some of the answers that the other people testifying gave.
For 5 minutes. Mr. Ness, I agree with you that if we don't get this right and we flush the innovators offshore into other countries, that getting them back is a lot more difficult. So hopefully, at least this start of the process with this hearing, that we can get to an answer that doesn't do that. Ms. Balday and Mr. Cooper, you each noted that tokens and crypto networks have the potential to create next generation open internet protocols. Can you flesh that out a little bit for the layman and myself that understand the words, but if you could tell us what those actually mean, it'd be a little helpful.
I believe there is a misunderstanding when people claim that this crypto space can create open internet networks. There's also a huge misunderstanding with the concept of blockchain, but not Bitcoin. They are one and the same. The word blockchain came from Satoshi Nakamoto. He used it in a description inside the code where it was just a description of how proof of work works. He wrote a sentence that says, when a proof of work solves a math problem and you put the transactions into a block, you attach that block to the prior blocks, and he referred to it as a blockchain. I heard that initially he referred to it as a time chain. That concept did not really matter to him. Once Bitcoin came out, a lot of people ran with this idea that decentralization is going to solve the world and we need all of these open source networks. In reality, right now, we only have one internet. It functions pretty well. Maybe if the original creators of the internet made it a little more private, a little more anonymous, we would have a slightly different world than we do today. But right now, we only have one internet. And I believe that in the future, we are only going to have one public blockchain. And just like today, some companies utilize the internet correctly, and they've built very successful businesses, from Amazon to Google to Netflix and others. Companies that utilize the internet well were able to take over in the industry. Netflix took over videos from Blockbuster. Amazon took over the sale of goods from shopping malls and catalogs that used to be sent to you by mail. And I believe that in the future, whichever companies utilize the Bitcoin public blockchain the best, those companies are going to succeed. But I believe that it is very misleading to believe that there will be all of these competing blockchains, just like the way we don't have multiple competing internets between public and private internets, multiple public internets competing with private internets. That's really not how this is going to work. So anyone that's trying to sell you on the idea that there will be multiple blockchains, they're usually just trying to sell a currency or they're trying to sell you a security masked as a utility token with an ICO, which we will talk about later in the hearings as well.
Mr. Fairfield, you talked about the Howey test, which seems to be the gold standard among securities lawyers who can spell that last name. You talked about that being maybe the outer edges? Since one of our questions we're trying to answer is, are the securities or the commodities, and where does that transition occur, and is it, where? Could you talk to us better about this Howey test, and why do you think that's the outer edge, and just how it should apply to distinguishing between commodities and securities?
Certainly. There are two questions. The first is, lawyers are inventive. They can rework the formal form of a transaction to make it into anything. Howey describes the outer limit of the kinds of legal forms that can be turned into investment contracts, that can be turned into this sort of exchange. I give you money now, and I wait, and I reap the benefit of your labor on the other end. But the difficulty with that is that while courts must be able to look to the economic realities of the transaction, look underneath the form, because if we just look at the form, if we just look at what it's called, then anyone can just title the asset whatever they want at the top of a piece of paper and escape whatever regulation they want. So courts have to look past the formal titling of the asset to the economic realities of it. However, they also have to understand that the very flexibility of these tools, both the flexibility of legal forms and the flexibility of this database technology, means that it is very possible for people to be using a product for one entirely legitimate purpose and have other people begin to use it for different purposes. An example of this from outside of the cryptocurrency area entirely would be the discussion we had several decades ago on VCRs. Right? The question was, some people use them to make illegal copies, many people don't. How far are we willing to go in rooting out bad uses that are beginning to cut away healthy tissue?
Ranking member.
So I have to stop right there. A couple of good things were said, but I guess I'll start from the end. I think it's a very bad analogy to compare the crypto space to the concept of a VCR. As was just explained, yes, some people will use the VCR to make illegal copies, which could be bad, and some people will use it well. This is the kind of analogy you want to use when it comes to money in general, or Bitcoin, or cars, or anything else for that matter. Or a knife could be used to prepare food. It could also be used to hurt someone. So that can also be applied to Bitcoin. Some people will use the Bitcoin as money for good, and some people may use Bitcoin as money for bad. The big difference where you can't compare something like a VCR is when it comes to ICOs. That is a very different thing. Sure, once the token is out there in the wild, you can perhaps claim that some people will use that token for good and some people will use that token for bad. But the critical point here is the creation of that token can certainly be, the current laws and regulations can certainly be applied to the creation of that token. And this is where the Howey test comes into play greatly. The basics of the Howey test are these. There are three elements to it. One, it's an investment of something financial. That's one. Two is you're investing in a common enterprise, which is either a company or a person, and then you as the investor putting in money into this entity, or common enterprise. You have an expectation of profit. Okay, that is the three most layman's basic facets of the Howey test. And I believe of all of the 1,000 or so ICOs that are out there, I only know of one that perhaps can avoid being classified as being in violation of the Howey test, though I have not looked at the entire 1,000. Out of the 100 or so I've actually looked at, I believe I found one that isn't in violation of the Howey test. So if we project that, so maybe there will be 10 out of 1,000 that aren't in violation of this Howey test. So this is something that the current laws were set to prevent, and that unfortunately is getting a little bit out of control at the moment.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know where to start. I'm somebody that believes we should still be on the gold standard. And
that is actually great. And since you still believe in the gold standard, I strongly recommend, Ranking Member Peterson, that you take a look at a book called The Bitcoin Standard by a PhD economist named Saifedean Ammous. You will not regret reading that book or listening to the audio version.
But I think we should audit the Fed because I don't really trust them. You know, so what worries me about this is that, you know, you say there's $250 billion of capitalization here or whatever. How much money is actually here? I mean, this is just seems like a Ponzi scheme to me. It's, you know, I mean, I think the stock market is a casino, you know, so that's where I'm coming from. So, I mean, so if I, you know, I'm going to send $100,000 to somebody through one of these deals, who's going to stand behind it? You know, where's the, you know, so I give the money, I guess, to one of you guys, and then you turn around and create these things and send it to somebody else. Well, what, in the meantime, what if you went broke? I mean, I was involved when we found out about credit default swaps and figured out that everybody was trading these things and there was nothing there. And if we wouldn't have stopped in, the whole economy would have collapsed. You know, and I don't know if we got a similar situation going on here with this, but, you know, what is behind this? I mean, if there's no money at the end of the day, who's going to make up for this? Can anybody explain that to me? Mr. Gensler?
Could I take a shot? I think that I'd split it in two buckets. In this field where venture capitalists, entrepreneurs are developing an idea and asking people for money, they publish a white paper, they build a following, Reddit posts, and these are different communities, social network posts, Medium and so forth. And they build a following and then they sell it and raise money. And sometimes it's small, just like a crowdfunding on Kickstarter. But most of them aren't. There's been 3,800 of them today. Over 50% of them fail within 4 months. And there's different estimates how many are scams and frauds. There are good faith actors in the middle of it too. A lot of good faith actors, but there's a lot of fraud and scams. If right now, if they fail, only way you could do is try under the securities laws to say they were an unregistered, non-compliant security and try to, under the private rights of actions under securities law, try to get something back. Nothing. In the second category, it's digital gold. The digital gold, which is Bitcoin. And while there's nothing behind it, I would say, Mr. Ranking Member, there's really nothing behind gold either. You might, all of us, we have what's behind it is a cultural norm that for thousands of years, we like gold. The value of gold, the worldwide value of gold is $7 trillion, by the way, just to give you a little sense of it. But only about 10% of the annual production of gold is used in manufacturing. The rest of it is because we think it's kind of nice to have gold necklaces and jewelry, or we do it as a store of value. So Bitcoin is a modern form of digital gold, and it's a social construct. But
that was a pretty good explanation. Like in my initial statement, I broke it down into 4 parts. Mr. Gensler broke it down into 2 parts, where he somewhat combined the first 3 parts into one, but referred to it as Bitcoin. I believe that there is a separation there. But if we do treat Bitcoin as digital gold, it does function, and its fundamentals seems to be somewhat based on the idea of gold with the concept of mining, with the concept of finite supply. And it will act potentially if the core developers and the code behind Bitcoin continues to be stable, as people gain more and more confidence in Bitcoin, that could become or even supplant gold as the next standard. Also, in Mr. Gensler's statements about his first part, and this being the ICOs, I would like to point out that they're not exactly like Kickstarter. The main difference between the ICO initiative and the Kickstarter initiative, or the Indiegogo initiative, people that are investing in Indiegogo or in Kickstarter, they're not exactly looking for an expectation of profit based on the labor or something done by other people. And this is the main difference. When someone donates or provides a small amount of capital, let's say $100 worth of capital, because they like the gadget that the Indiegogo campaign is trying to create, their expectation is simply the gadget once it's actually manufactured. It's hard to make the argument that that person is trying to buy that gadget in order to resell it for an expectation of profit. In this case, not only can that not be argued, nothing is actually being created. People are buying and getting a digital security where the only thing you can really do with that digital security is resell it for a profit. And I believe that all of the statements that these tokens are needed for the functionality of that software are pretty much I believe that they're lying. And I can make an argument in anything, in any of the software, other than the use of it as money, like in the case of Bitcoin and some of the Bitcoin clones, even Zcash or Litecoin or Monero, and many other clones whose sole purpose is to replace money, then absolutely they need that token. If you're not trying to replace money, then the use of that token in that software is dubious at best and fraudulent most likely.
But the money, they're just creating this money out of nowhere. I mean,
in the first category, the investor type that would be under the SEC. But in the second category, you're right, which was under this committee. I mean, you're going to be grappling with this for a while, I think.
That's also a good point. In the first case, like Bitcoin, you're not really creating anything out of thin air because you are spending money on hardware and the computers that mine the Bitcoin, and B, the electricity to run that hardware. So nothing is really being created out of thin air. There is a lot of investment that goes in creating value, what is Bitcoin, and the value of Bitcoin is basically going up based on the confidence of Bitcoin being a store of value and a medium of exchange. Now, in the other case of the ICOs, absolutely, that value is being created simply out of thin air. Same goes for the concept of proof of work, where you lock up the tokens and earn more tokens, just like our interest rate model. Though even in the interest rate model of traditional finance, the interest doesn't just come out of thin air. You put money in a bank, that money is loaned, and the borrower pays interest on that money. So there is some kind of an activity. When people simply lock up their digital tokens in order to earn more tokens, there is no actual function, and there is no actually happening underneath it to generate more money out of thin air. We can also do an analogy with the IPO space and traditional stock market, where when a company does go public, some people can claim that that value is also being created out of thin air. But today, it's very difficult to go public on the stock market unless you actually have some kind of revenue. You may not have profit yet, but you certainly have revenue. You have a company. You are following lots of legal standards in order to go public. In the 1990s, with all the dot-coms going public, we saw an era of companies that had absolutely nothing behind them going public and generating all this value in their stock price. And that led to the big dot-com bubble. I believe we are witnessing something similar today, and it will probably end in a similar way when it comes to the ICOs. And this is what separates Bitcoin, the digital gold, from a lot of these ICOs that are creating value out of thin air simply by paying for advertising.
I mean, in the first category, I mean, no, I assume those people are sophisticated enough to realize they're going to get fleeced.
Absolutely not. I believe that 95 to 99% of the people, maybe even more than 99% of the people, have absolutely no idea that they're going to get fleeced. They have a complete misunderstanding of the decentralized technology that Bitcoin has given the world in its value transfer. And everything is stemming from hype that they would be able to resell these tokens with absolutely no underlying value behind them. Now, if this is happening to qualified investors, then they should have an understanding, but the ICO space completely avoids all of that regulation that has been in place since the Howey test. So no, thinking that people investing in ICOs understand that they're going to get fleeced. Maybe the very qualified investors, perhaps even a lot of the high-level VCs that are investing the biggest chunk into the ICO market in the very, very early stages, and they are cashing out of those investments in also unreasonably early stages, way earlier than traditional regulation on IPOs and traditional VC investing would allow them to do. They will probably not get fleeced because they understand that they are fleecing the unqualified investor in the unregulatory market.
Potentially, I mean, are they? Or I think there's people get into that area that don't realize what they're getting into. They think somehow they're going to get rich, and they're going to, get into this deal ahead of everything else, and it's going to go up, and they're going to make 10,000% on their money and whatever else. And some guy is selling them, on this. I mean, I don't know where the protection is here. Thank you.
There really is no protection right now in this space. This could have been something could have been done a few years ago when the ICOs were still popping up. Some people were very vocal about it, and but nothing was done in order to stop Ethereum from building this platform to create an environment for all of these ICOs. And yes, it is starting to look like a bubble, and it will probably get worse. But the general public has been absolutely convinced that the rich get richer because they get to speculate in very early stage startups. The reality of the situation is that the rich get poorer by speculating in very early stage startups. And very few of those startups actually make it to be big companies like Uber and Airbnb, and even from the .com days like Amazon and Google, and all the rest. Those are very, very few, and the majority of these fail. I believe that VCs cannot beat the performance of something like the S&P 500 over the long term. But I also think that it's great that people with resources that are rich, that can spend those resources, get to invest in these very early stage startups so that some of them succeed, and then allow the retail investor or the mom and pops to invest in these companies after they have moved on from this very dangerous early stage process. I believe the current regulations that we've had for a long time are sufficient, but they have just not been enforced in any way to allow for this. One last point is that one of the reasons why I felt the .com bubble got out of control was because of brokers that were now just .coms. I'm not blaming the brokers, but when any person can now trade from the comfort of their home, this is how your taxi driver, your hairdresser, your shoe salesman now get to speculate on all the penny stocks and all of the early IPOs that were coming online in the 2000s. Prior to that, they didn't really have much access to be able to speculate. Now, I think it's great that anyone from home can currently speculate on companies that go public. Is just that the companies that go public for that speculation, they need to be real companies with real revenue following some regulation, and not simply words in front of a television to get all these people interested in speculation. But that's what happened when your barber started telling you about the latest IPO. Currently, in the crypto and the ICO environments, it might actually be worse because There are no geographical restrictions on trading crypto assets. There are no age restrictions on trading crypto assets. You can be 13 and you can go on your way in speculating. There are no financial restrictions at all. Even in the .com days, you needed a bank account. You probably needed a few $1,000s to speculate with. You needed at least $25,000 to be a day trader. All of those restrictions are gone. Again, I'm not saying that these restrictions are absolutely needed, but the types of assets that people should be speculating on are assets that have something there and not just a single piece of paper describing what they're planning to do in the near future, maybe.
But I'm still skeptical.
Mr. Lucas, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And along with the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, I have the privilege of sitting both on this committee and financial services. So I welcome this discussion by the panel when it comes to the next regulatory frontier as it impacts the two committees. First, Mr. Cooper, how should regulators think about the function of the token when choosing to apply regulatory requirements? Should regulators look to the functioning of the token at all or only the issuing activity? And for example, say there's a cryptocurrency, we'll call it for the sake of discussion, Bitcoin 2.0, and say it functions identically to Bitcoin in every way except that a small portion of the total tokens were pre-mined and distributed in a token sale. Is it possible to issue Bitcoin 2.0 through an ICO and not have it be a security? Or is the functioning of the token irrelevant because of the manner in which it's issued? So I'm asking what my folks back home would define as geek questions, but this is where we are.
Yes, sir.
What say you?
So yes, a couple things. So the issuance of those tokens and the sale of those tokens in exchange for money before a network exists, I do believe is what's called an investment contract and should be regulated as such. So if I develop a white paper and I tell you I'm going to build this thing and you give me money for it before it exists, if I fleece you, absolutely, the SEC has jurisdiction to bring me up on securities fraud charges. You have private cause of action. No question about there. Once the network is functional and therefore the tokens are doing what they were intended to do, whether that's storage or other things, the value of that token now really is not a function of the efforts of the developer. It's really the question of what's the utility of that token, much like any other commodity. And so therefore, certainly my view is that in that case, the underlying token itself should be regulated as if it were a commodity, because that's actually kind of the nature of what it's actually doing.
Thank you. Mr.
So I slightly disagree with that because I believe that when Ethereum launched, it was an unlicensed, unregistered security in violation of the Howey test. This was incredibly obvious and to some, but chosen to be ignored by the regulators. And that led us to the big mess we are pretty much in today with all of these ICOs following the model of Ethereum, whose only use case so far has been for others to get money from unqualified investors.
Yes, the last prong of the Howey test identifies as an investment contract or transaction in which an individual expects profits solely from the efforts of the promoter or the third party. Yet for almost every token project, there are multiple avenues for a holder to come into possession of a token. When a network's fully functional, a token can be purchased through a promoter, traded on a secondary market exchange within a network, or earned by performing work to support the network. In each of these cases, the efforts of the holder vary and can implicate the Howey test differently. How should regulators think of an asset that has multiple methods of delivery, an asset that can be both purchased and earned, or should the method of delivery determine the regulatory regime governing an asset?
Fortunately, I think it's a relatively simple answer.
I could not disagree more. This is a very, very complicated answer because I don't know of a single case where something was a security, not recognized as a security and allowed to move on, and then classified as not a security. I have absolutely no idea what the SEC is going to do. I believe the SEC recognizes by now that they messed up very, very badly by not recognizing that Ethereum was an unlicensed, unregistered, uncompliant security between 2014 when it was first introduced and I believe 2016 when the Ethereum token was finally being traded. And this is going to be a big problem, what to do about it now. Because if you say that Ethereum was a security, but now it's too late to do anything about it because it's no longer a security, then I believe that opens, basically, I think it creates a very blurred line where every other ICO project in the world can now claim, well, if you give us enough time, like you did Ethereum, we will no longer be securities. And this would apply to scams or projects that think they're not scams, but in reality probably are. This is a really big problem. And because the regulatory ball was dropped, and it's unfortunate that no representative of the SEC is here to speak in front of you today, but hopefully there will be explanations on what happened, and perhaps there is a way to rectify the situation, though I believe it is going to be very difficult, if not completely impossible.
Which is,
Gorfine, in your testimony, you mentioned the new working group set up by FSOC and the commission's work with the SEC and other regulators. This committee cares a lot about coordination between financial regulators when it comes to these sorts of matters. So can you talk more about how the regulators, including the CFTC, and working together, I should say, to understand and clarify their overlapping jurisdictions and how it affects virtual currencies? Mr. Chairman, if you'd indulge me for one last thought, for a number of years, I sat next to Ron Paul on the Financial Services Committee. So when Mr. Peterson brought up his observations about gold standard, I can't help but think about Mr. Paul's story, noting that when the Roosevelt administration took us off the gold standard in '33, they sealed every safe deposit box in every financial institution in America. And before you could open it, you had to have a federal official of appropriate nature or state designee to be with you so they could make sure you didn't have any gold coins, gold bars, or gold certificates in those safe deposit boxes. So I think the ranking member brings up some interesting observations.
That is a very good point, and that happened a long time ago, so clearly no one is alive to remember that themselves. It's just something we can read in history books. However, this is one of the reasons why people foresee Bitcoin is valuable, because a lot of these, certainly all of our other assets, including gold and fiat government currency, and a lot of these centralized tokens pretending to be decentralized, they're all at risk of confiscation. And one of the reasons why Bitcoin is so popular is because that if you properly store Bitcoin yourself without a counterparty, it is unconfiscatable. So the events of the 30s where people thought that something of value they were storing was safe, it turned out it wasn't safe because the government had passed a law giving them the ability to confiscate that value. One of the reasons why Bitcoin was created, and one of the properties of Bitcoin is to prevent this ability of governments or anyone with a bigger gun to confiscate something of value from you. And as long as Bitcoin remains having that property and the decentralized nature of Bitcoin will make sure that this property exists. Otherwise, Bitcoin may not have any value.
Even gold wasn't safe in '33. Yield back, Mr.
long reach of government. So thank you. David Scott, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a good amount of very serious and legitimate concern about coins that are being offered. I mean, I'm not sure we realize it, but there are over 1,600 coins currently and growing every day. And we've got to look closely and watch how these coins are being used. And if it is appropriate for them to be regulated, to make sure that they're not being used improperly. I'm not sure that the panelists or the audience or those who may be watching via television know, but I find it very concerning that in the indictment of the 12 Russian hackers, that hacked the DNC's servers? Did you know that they included in those charges within the indictment was the fact that the Russian hackers used principally Bitcoin when purchasing the servers?
Mr. Scott, would you feel more comfortable if this was the 2012 election and the alleged hackers used US dollars to purchase server space in order to do hacking? I apologize. I digress. Let's move on.
When registering the domains and otherwise making payments in furtherance of illegal hacking activity on the United States elections. So what I'm saying is that with every new tool, our technology is moving fast. It's going at a rapid rate. And we've got to grab hold on what we're doing to make sure that we do everything we can to ensure that these new coins are not being used illegally or for illicit activities, like when the Russians attacked our election system. Now, I also have read in some news coverage of studies that are out there that think that not all of these ICOs are a positive thing. There's a lot of debate on that.
Austin Scott, 5 minutes.
So in this case, the representatives of Congress and Senate, there is a big disconnect with the idea of a person's private property. And I believe that a person's private property is exactly what it sounds like, private property. And people should have the right to use their property, or in this case, money, how they like. So going after a person's money is not, I believe, is not how law should be done. If a person is doing something illegal, then yes, that person is doing something illegal. But the value transfer mechanism that that person is using, whether he's using US dollars, whether he's using a car to pay for something, gold coins, or anything else, that object should not be criminalized. The person should be criminalized, not the object. On the concept of ICOs, I completely agree. The majority, if not all of them, are fraudulent because I believe that they are violating all of the laws that exist on the solicitation of money from the general public.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And well, we are a long way from the peanut fields in Sycamore, Georgia.
Nice try. I don't get it.
And I can't help but wonder if somebody who, prior to getting elected to Congress, actually had a Series 7 what would a prospectus on a coin offering look like? I don't know if it would be 1 page or 10,000 pages or more. But one thing that's clear to me is that you can certainly create a coin for anything. You can create a coin for any color. You can create a coin for any opposite color. So there's an infinite number of coins that could be created. I see no way to regulate every coin offering that's out there. But I would also tell you that when you turn on CNBC and they show the Dow, the S&P, and the NASDAQ on one side of the screen, and on the other side of the screen is a value for Bitcoin, then certainly it's reached the level where we need to have some type of regulatory certainty in this area. Most of my questions are for Mr. Gorfine. You run Lab CFTC.
So I completely agree. you could create a coin for any color, and you can create a coin for any opposite color. This is actually exactly what is taking place right now in the ICO space. People are creating coins for anything and everything they can think of, as long as they can convince the general public into speculating on those coins. They will not blatantly say that's what they're trying to do, that they are trying to convince the general public to speculate on their coins that represent a color or the opposite color, because if it was that easy for them, if it was that easy for us to watch them say it, then it would be very, very easy for the regulators to crack down on that practice. So every one of these ICOs does everything they can to speak very carefully as to not be blatant about their actual expectation of creating assets to get the general public to invest, because they don't have a company and they don't have any revenue, and all they have is an idea. So you are also correct that there's not going to be any kind of prospectus on any years, because the company doesn't even exist. It may not even be a company. It may just be a person in his basement that wrote a 1-page or a 40-page white paper. It'll probably be 40 pages. I remember when I was at my university, someone famously said you can dazzle them with brilliance or baffle them with BS. And a lot of these white papers are baffling people with BS by making these white papers 40, 50, 100 pages long, while the paper about Bitcoin was only 8 pages and very, very clear as to what its intentions really are. So that is absolutely correct. And I know it may seem scary right now, but somehow after the .com bubble, we did not have hundreds of IPOs of .coms, and the only reason they became IPOs was because they had a .com in their name, with absolutely no revenue and no product and no customers and no prospect of customers or anything like that. And I believe that there wasn't much regulation back then that led to this .com bubble that allowed all of these companies to trade on the NASDAQ for hundreds of dollars a share, when in reality, they should have never even been allowed to trade. But the bubble eventually came, and the industry got a lot more selective as to which companies go public for an IPO. We are seeing a complete repeat of that, where 20 years later, people have realized that, hey, we have forgotten that the reason why companies go IPO was because they need to have something tangible underneath. We can get around the concept of having anything tangible underneath, and we can simply go public like the IPOs of the 90s with absolutely no financials. We will just do it on top of Ethereum, for example, or on top of Ethereum's competitors with absolutely nothing to show to the prospective investors.
And you have held office hours around the country where you've met with many people in the industry. Can you tell us about the interests and concerns of the developers who are working on token-based projects, and how sensitive they are to the regulatory environment?
Most developers that are working on token-based projects could not care less about the regulations, whether they are programming on something honest like Bitcoin, or whether they are programming the underlying for an ICO that is an outright scam, because their job is simply to program the technology. So in the case of Bitcoin, it is decentralized. So they're just programming technology, kind of like the developers of the internet are just programming technology. In the case of things outside of Bitcoin, most of these developers are simply employees for hire, and they will jump from project to project. They will simply program it and let the creators of that initiative do all of the promotion and make money. But these developers are simply employees. Or in the case of Bitcoin, they're mostly volunteers. Yes, there are some Bitcoin competitors in currency space that are also volunteers because they believe that technology is better, as misguided as they might be. But for all of these projects, for the majority of the space, these are people that are hired to program something that works or barely works or pretends to work, and then they move on to the next project.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman, sorry, Ms. Custer, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you. This has been a very enlightening hearing, and I appreciate all the wisdom. Mr. Gorfine, picking up on the CFTC regulation such as it is, do you have sufficient resources at the CFTC, or what would you recommend that you need from Congress going forward?
Thank you. Well, I'll harness the chairman on this. Our chairman's been very vocal about the need for the CFTC to have the right resources to be able to keep pace with our markets and regulate our markets most effectively. I believe he's asked for $281 million for our budget. And a lot of those resources would be utilized not only with bringing in economists, but also making sure we have the technologists in-house to be able to keep pace. I'm a lawyer. I know a couple layers deep of the onion when you're talking about technologies, but we really need to be able to get to the core of technology to make sure that we're ascertaining where new risks are arising. So certainly with greater resources, our agency would be able to even scale up some of those activities.
So
no government agency ever has enough money. They always need more money. In this case, the CFTC also, especially the SEC, does need experts that understand the crypto space. It's a very high probability that they will get the wrong experts that are invested in a lot of these unregulated securities. So, but yes, and those experts will also need to get paid. So yes, this is going to be a bit of an issue.
I would just say for the record, one obvious place to look for those resources would be to get the IRS on top of how to tax the benefits and the gains that are being made. Because one of the most troubling comments today is that the IRS is not on top of how to capture those gains. And I think that's something that we need to look at, but it's also something on your side with some conversations with your counterparts at the IRS.
I believe that is incorrect. Whatever revenue the IRS collects from crypto, and I believe it should be no revenue. I believe that, as in the hearings from the same day where Dr. Michelle talked about how tax revenue on something that is money or currency should not exist. Even if the IRS continues to collect profits from this, there's absolutely nothing making that revenue, the IRS's revenue, go towards CFTC. The way the CFTC should function is just like in a traditional space, or I'm hoping in traditional space, they need to collect a very, very small fee, from every microtransaction, and those fees go to funding the regulatory space. So this way, you are not taxing people's profits, just like you have a fee for making a stock trade. There are exchange fees, and I believe there are regulatory fees as well. I'm not actually sure about that. I should probably double check that. So don't hold me to that one, please. But taxing people's skill set is certainly the wrong way to go about it. And that tax revenue will be misplaced, and it will not go to the CFTC or SEC, and it will use for other purposes. But a direct form, something like, hey, you're trading and you're paying a micro fee on that trade, and that fee goes to the CFTC, is something that makes a lot more sense in this case.
I want to quickly turn to the two professors and get a sense of a very troublesome aspect of this, and if anyone else wants to comment. So Credit Suisse analysts last year identified that 4% of the addresses hold 97% of the Bitcoin in the world. And the philosophical goal of Bitcoin is to replace governmental-backed fiat currency. But if that goal is achieved, you'd have an unprecedented amount of wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people. Is this concerning to you, and what should lawmakers be doing in this regard?
This is not concerning at all, and an unfortunate misunderstanding of statistics and numbers. When it's said that like 97% of all Bitcoin is held by 0.4 or 0.04% of accounts, there's several things that go into that. One is that each account is being treated as a single person's account. It's almost like saying 95% of all of our dollars, all of Americans' savings are being held by 0.4% or 0.04% of accounts, where you treat JP Morgan Bank as a single account. When in reality, JP Morgan Bank holds accounts for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. It's the same thing in the crypto space. An account from an exchange that could be holding Bitcoin on behalf of 10, 20, 30,000 Bitcoin holders are treated as a single account for the purposes of those statistics. In addition, the way Bitcoin works is new accounts are constantly being created. New public keys are constantly being created. So 98 or 99% of all of the public keys actually have absolutely no Bitcoin in them. And they need to be eliminated from that statistic. The majority of all of these accounts are just zero. There's no value there. I'm not going to get into the technical reasons as to why they exist. And also, a single programmer can create millions of these public keys or accounts in a span of a day, skewing the statistic even more. And a lot of these addresses were actually being created like that to make Bitcoin look very bad and very centralized from a power perspective, when in reality, it absolutely isn't. There are additional points on this because you cannot create new Bitcoin out of thin air. A single entity or a single person having a lot of Bitcoin does not allow them to have more Bitcoin. So sooner or later, they will use the Bitcoin or the value that they have, and they will now have less value. So even if Satoshi Nakamoto was to come back, and it's speculated that Satoshi, or the entity that is Satoshi, has between 5 and maybe even probably between 3 and 5% of all the Bitcoin in circulation. Even if Satoshi's coins were to be revealed, all they can do is spend the value and they will have a lot less Bitcoin. It's the ability to create more value from having value, like in ideas of proof of stake or interest. That's where things go horribly wrong. But in Bitcoin, this is absolutely not a concern. On a final note, I would like to add that if you feel that Bitcoin, the Bitcoin holdings are centralized in the hands of a few entities, all of the other cryptocurrencies are infinitely worse from that perspective. So the next most decentralized or the next most spread out cryptocurrency is probably 10 to 100 times more concentrated in the hands of a few players. So Bitcoin really is miles ahead of any other decentralized effort to separate government power from control of all value transfer.
Yeah, generally goes back. Mr. Allen, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this has been very interesting. The gig economy is moving at light speed, and the rest of us are just kind of dragging us along. But it is exciting. I guess the problem that we're having is, from a regulatory standpoint, is throughout the gig economy, is obviously the reason it's doing so well is because there's lots of freedom and very little regulation. But we do know that there are lots of problems. People are, I mean, as far as connectivity, as far as security and that sort of thing. How do we reach a balance with this? What we're doing is we're creating another money supply here, as I see it. In other words, it's global. I mean, it's a global currency. I just don't know how that works. Where like we have our basis, our dollar, I believe, kind of sets the mark for the world right now. Explain how this is going to work across the world. I mean, you mentioned Afghanistan. I don't know what their currency base there is, but I'm just going to open it up. I mean, I can't visualize how this could possibly work.
Can I give it one real quick shot? Is governments, sound governments like the U.S. I mean, if we have to maintain our fiscal discipline and all the things we need to do.
Yeah, if you can keep it, right?
Yeah, but sound governments have certain advantages, I think, because of the stability, and also because we allow our currency, fiat currency, to be used for all, it's legal tender for all debts, public and private, and you can use it to pay taxes. And so there's some just natural advantages. I think that how this might play out, I could see a country that's in distress, the Venezuelas of the world, where in the future, one of these currencies will be a better thing for their public than in that.
For their individual citizens.
For the individuals, for the merchants.
Because they're not dealing through their government, they're dealing through this global currency.
Yeah, I could see that. I secondly think even in a stable economy like ours, that our Federal Reserve, with all respect, has a little bit of competition for the payment system. We Americans spend between $100 billion and $200 billion a year for our payment system. That's only 0.5% to 1% of our economy, but it's still $100 billion to $200 billion a year. And so startups and entrepreneurs have a chance to chip away at that and get inside of that. That's competition to the commercial banks and the central bank on our payment system.
Other feed.
So several pretty good points there by Mr. Gensler, in that in the U.S. economy, there's a lot less of a need for something like Bitcoin as opposed to something like Venezuela, where the people of that country do not trust the government currency and they are seeking alternatives. Now, having said that, the US dollar still remains probably one of the best alternatives to the country of Venezuela, but the US dollar is frowned upon by their government and their law enforcement in a similar way that they will frown upon Bitcoin. For more modern countries like the US and Europe, Bitcoin still has three main advantages on traditional fiat currency. One of them is the hard money nature of Bitcoin, as explained by Professor Seyfuddin Ammous in the Bitcoin Standard, in that the world will eventually default back to hard money like we did with gold. And Bitcoin has pretty unchangeable economic aspects of the way new Bitcoin is being created. We know the emission rate of new Bitcoin. We know the inflation rate of Bitcoin, and that inflation rate is going to slow down over time. Over the 9-year period, Bitcoin has proven to be pretty immutable, not only from its economic aspect and its economic laws that define Bitcoin and how many Bitcoin we're going to have for the rest of time, and how that Bitcoin is being created, and also the confidence that the Bitcoin network as a payment network remains with 99.99% uptime. The second reason why people might choose Bitcoin is the unconfiscatability nature of Bitcoin. As mentioned earlier, even gold was confiscated in the 1930s, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to confiscate a person's Bitcoin if they're properly storing it. And the third nature of Bitcoin that gives it a slight advantage for some versus the traditional fiat currencies is the concept of permissionless value transfer, the peer-to-peer decentralized nature, where you're not relying on a middleman to make that payment. And yes, this property is obviously fairly useful to those that want to pay for activities or goods that governments of those regions may seem to be illegal. But just like in this country, purchasing of narcotics, other than, well, marijuana is becoming legalized, but other narcotics besides marijuana in this country may seem to be illicit, and the US government doesn't like when people are using Bitcoin to purchase that. While in Venezuela, as was mentioned, the government has food control prices, and they control the amount of food you can buy and with what currency. So people using Bitcoin to buy food for the government of Venezuela is just as egregious as for the US government to watch Bitcoin being used for other activity, including the purchase of computer gear and server space, as again, we heard earlier.
We got about 2 minutes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that around the Venezuela point that there was some interesting usage of Zcash in Venezuela over the last year.
I can see where I could.
So an unfortunate advertisement for Zcash, of which Ms. Baldet is on the board of the Zcash Foundation. And that's, again, very unfortunate in that Zcash is not really decentralized. It is not secure. It is not going to be scalable. And that is the consensus on the technology from the smarter people in the crypto space. So please don't walk away thinking that Zcash is actually something viable, please.
Business located in a country where the government is unstable, the business community could really benefit from this. What nation would, I mean, so then you got this competition between, you know, right now, I guess the biggest competition is between United States and China. I mean, you know, they're, the yen seems to want to be the basis. How do you, I mean, which nation would run this thing and ultimately be responsible for it? Thank you very much.
Darren, 5 minutes.
So that's the beauty of it. When it comes to Bitcoin and this decentralized nature, there really is nobody in charge. When it comes to all of the other initiatives, Zcash included, there are people in charge because they were created as for-profit ventures. As explained in my first 5 minutes, I mentioned that there is Bitcoin. There are copycats of Bitcoin that are close to Bitcoin, but will not hold up because they were created later and with visible, noticeable people, but they were created fairly. All the other initiatives that were created as for-profit entities for a few people to get rich, there are people that are running these efforts, and they can absolutely be regulated into the future, which is why they're not going to succeed and they will fail on their own. But how many people will get fleeced with them before that happens is remain to be seen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cryptocurrency, blockchain, technology all have tremendous potential, and I'm bullish on the prospect. But we're in kind of a bizarre position here. Satoshi Nakamoto, an unknown person or people who developed Bitcoin, and this person or persons has 980,000 Bitcoins and an estimated worth between 19.4 billion to 17.9 billion. So can any of you today, and just raise your hand, verify that Mr. Satoshi Nakamoto is in fact a person or persons?
I don't believe that we've all agreed that it's a male.
All I asked, okay.
Satoshi is female.
Satoshi.
All right. Lots of things to say, but I'll just say this. This is why adults should be invited to hearings to speak in front of Congress. Let's move on.
She's female, great. So none of you can verify who founded or owned Bitcoin, is my point, which puts us in a strange position because normally we have industries and new currencies where we know who created it. So that puts us in a weird position. In addition, you mine to develop new currency, a process by which transactions are verified and you add it to the public ledger. You compile recent transactions into blocks and try solving computationally difficult puzzles, and you get a reward, either I guess a transaction fee or newly released Bitcoin. Have we ever, I guess gold is the only thing that we could even parallel to where we've mined in such a way. Have we ever had a currency online like this where you mine via transaction algorithms and solving puzzles on the internet?
No, and this is the achievement and the invention of the 21st century. This is the innovation at hand. The fact that Satoshi Nakamoto, the entity or the person, and there is absolutely zero proof that it was a female, and not saying it had to be a male, but there's zero proof that there was a female. That was the mathematical solution to the double spending problem of being able to send digital data while losing possession of that data. This process is not cheap. This process is not simple, and it relies on the burning of electricity in order to achieve this marvel of a fintech space, which is a cross between technology and finance. And so far, the only application of it that makes sense is for it to be used as money and a medium of exchange.
Time's limited. So we have an unknown person and a bizarre way of mining Bitcoin to get it together. I'm more concerned, though, about being able to avoid money laundering for terrorism, drug trafficking, human trafficking, tax evasion. So I'd love to hear from each of you in one sentence on what we could do to stop money laundering and having Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies be the choice of terrorists, drug traffickers, and those evading taxes. We'll start from the left and go on back.
So there was a lot there. The current governments have put a lot of emphasis, as mentioned earlier, of blaming the value transfer for a person's bad actions. Now, different countries criminalize different social contracts that have absolutely no victims. It's hard to make the analogy, but in the 100 years ago, alcohol was not legal. And then 20 years later, alcohol was now legal. The biggest culprit of during that time was Al Capone, who's, of course, did lots of criminal things, but he was working in, his main focus was providing the world with alcohol. And he eventually went to prison for tax evasion. He didn't go to prison for the bad things that he did. He went to prison for evading taxes. And unfortunately, that lesson for the next 100 years never really sunk in, that law enforcement need to do a better job of putting criminals away for the crimes that they do and not use the IRS to put away people that they don't like for not complying with the laws that they created, by using other agencies, by blaming money on that. So either a lot of the laws are very draconian that create these imbalances in the market, and perhaps the laws need to be more clearer, and there should be less laws on voluntary contracts between people that have absolutely no victims, or you have to understand that money is a person's property, and a person should not be criminalized just for the use of that value transfer. So this is should be a very long discussion but start thinking about it in that way.
The alleged Russian hackers were caught because they used Bitcoin.
Now, that is true. At the moment, Bitcoin isn't very anonymous, and it's probably one of the worst tools for criminals at the moment, because they could certainly be found by tracing their Bitcoin transactions. Bitcoin's competitors that claim to be way more secure and way more anonymous are not much better in the space at the moment, and will be significantly worse into the future if governments around the world continue to abuse the concept of people using Bitcoin and criminalize people for merely their use of Bitcoin. The developers of the decentralized Bitcoin protocol will have such anonymity features on the use of that Bitcoin that it will be significantly worse. My recommendation to Congress is that criminals need to be caught for the bad things that they do, not for what medium of exchange they use. And the US dollar still remains the most popular choice for that.
Thank you. Also concerned about two practices, spoofing and wash trading. Spoofing being flooding markets with fake orders to trick other traders into buying or selling, and wash trading, which is where cheaters trade with his or herself to give a false impression of market demand that lures others to dive into. So can anybody give us any insight into how to stop spoofing and wash trading? And we'll start from the right to the left now.
You know, that's a tough one. I don't have a good answer.
Okay, next.
Register the exchanges and cops on the beat.
Yeah, we're a markets regulator. That's something that we're able to police for within our regulated futures and swaps markets. And so worth a look at the underlying market to ensure that the right types of regulations are in place.
And are you all doing that right now?
The CFTC does not have direct oversight authority over underlying markets.
So we would have to give you jurisdiction to help with spoofing and wash trading.
It would be something Congress would have to look at in terms of authorities.
Next, Mr. Kapoor.
Yeah, I agree. Either between the SEC or the CFTC, you'd have to grant appropriate authority.
All right, thanks.
So again, I'm gonna have to throw a question back. How was this resolved, or is it currently resolved in the traditional financial markets? And if you feel that it is sufficiently resolved in the traditional financial markets, then the same exact rules and regulations should apply to the underlying trading of Bitcoin. Perhaps you can enforce the programming nature of these. The exchange that does trade cryptocurrencies, or Bitcoin in particular, needs to be able to prove to the CFTC that they have taken technological, that they have done the technological part to prevent spoofing and other kinds of maliciousness going on in the underlying exchanges that are currently completely unregulated. Not saying that the regulation will necessarily solve this problem, and a lot of people feel that regulation is a burden. But if the underlying trading of Bitcoin is to be taken seriously, a lot of this stuff needs to be programmatically removed from the exchanges, and certainly it's up to the exchanges to get that done. But right now, no exchange is obligated to do that, and they can certainly profit internally.
So now you're back.
Yep, Jim's back. Mr. Fazo, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering if, for the benefit of our viewers at home across the country who are watching this hearing and are trying to understand the impact of the cryptocurrencies and what the future holds, if perhaps Ms. Balday and Mr. Cooper could tell us where you think, from a 5 to 10 year viewpoint, where this is going to be, the role that these currencies are going to have in our economy, and how might this affect average consumers? Right now, the market participants are mostly very sophisticated people. Do you see this insinuating itself into the broader economy?
It's very difficult to project 5 to 10 years down the road, and there is a huge difference between 5 years and 10 years, but I will go ahead and give it a shot. I believe that Bitcoin will continue to separate from everything in the crypto space, and that will continue to be that. On the ICO front, I believe that it's hard to predict how big the bubble is going to grow. People continuously compare the current crypto environment to the environment of the 1990s, but it's hard to say if we are currently in 1993 versus 94, or are we currently in 1998, 1999? If we are in 98, 99, then this ICO bubble of people believing that the .coms with absolutely no developers and nothing more than a fancy website can be valued at billions of dollars for that company, then hopefully that will come to an end very, very soon. And all of these .coms with absolutely no revenue and no clients and no profit, like 99% of them are, all of those initiatives will eventually go to zero. But if we are currently in the 94, 95 comparison to that, that means the ICO euphoria, FOMO, as people like to say, and irrational exuberance, as Mr. Greenspan coined in the early 1990s, is just getting started, then this bubble can grow to biblical proportions on a global scale. I believe regulation may play some part, whether it's a good part or a bad part in diffusing the bubble and the outcomes. So it's impossible to say where on the bubble chart from people investing in fictional ideas that seem to have value, where that is. And that will be one of the biggest challenges. As far as where will Bitcoin be in 5 to 10 years as a medium of exchange and an unconfiscatable value transfer, that also has a lot of factors. One of them is, of course, technological. The Bitcoin network needs to continue to be more stable as a payment network, which right now has been functional 99.99% of the time since 2009. That needs to be higher. That needs to be 99.99999% of the time with absolutely no downtime. It has to continue to scale. It has to be a lot more useful. And at the same time, a lot will depend on the global economic structure. If the US economy continues to grow and the US perhaps loosens some of their money laundering laws and allow people to use their money more like their property without fear of being treated as criminals for having money or using money as they like, that might actually slow down the adoption of Bitcoin. In addition, if the U.S. government and other first world governments, stay pretty fiscally conservative and not run up debts and do not print money and keep as low inflation as possible, that can also slow down the use of Bitcoin. But I foresee things going in the opposite direction. Sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, there will probably be some recessions. There will probably be some more economic instability in some parts of the world. And if the solution to those instabilities is the confiscation of people's money, like what happened in Cyprus, when bank accounts were shut down and 50% of all the euros above 100,000 euros in banks were confiscated. If banks shut down, like what happened in Greece in 2015, and people weren't able to use the traditional financial system, if lots of printing to bail out certain industries, if that continues to occur, then Bitcoin could gain even more popularity. Also in Venezuela right now, the country of Venezuela can probably get around some of the sanctions, and maybe other countries can probably get around some, or the people in those countries are getting around some of the sanctions that the world is placing on them. And I would say the best way for them to get around those sanctions is still by using paper US dollar bills. And their second best way in order to move that externally is probably Bitcoin. So we will see where that goes from that point of view as well. All of this adds to Bitcoin being more useful for the world economy. The elimination of cash will go a long way for bigger adoption of Bitcoin, because humans do need a way to use money in a way they see fit. So if the elimination of cash comes hand in hand with looser money laundering laws, that could be a good thing. If the elimination of cash comes with stricter money laundering enforcement, that would probably increase the use of Bitcoin in the world's economy.
And Mr. Fairfield, you referenced personal privacy issues. How do you see that coming into play here?
Personal privacy issues will, of course, come in. Right now, Bitcoin is not seen as an anonymous value transfer, but it could be, and that is a matter of development. From a personal perspective, I would like to see governments be less draconian on people's privacy and knowing everything every citizen does, and especially knowing that every penny a citizen spends and what they spend it on. But if the laws on a person's privacy continue to increase, the development on making Bitcoin payments more private and more anonymous will also continue to increase to maintain the balance and give people more privacy.
And just generally, Mr. Gensler or Mr. Gorfine, as we look at the development of this, it does seem that there is a issue that's going to affect government, which is right now we know, because we have paper trail, we have electronic trails and documentation of transactions for which taxation applies, for which government oversight and reporting applies. How does government address this from the standpoint of its interest to try to make sure that taxation and other compliance issues are resolved, that currently with our existing financial transactions, we have mechanisms to have that reporting?
I think it's really about knowing all the accounts. This technology has what's called public keys and private keys, and Zcash, which was Baudet's involved in, is even more secret than that. But
not really. But let's go
on. It's really knowing who owns the accounts behind that. So it's know your customer, beneficial ownership, and then trying to do that through some of these central mechanisms like crypto exchanges. It's not going to be perfect. This is going to be like a whack-a-mole, that it's going to be, it's the IRS and the CFTC will work hard, and then 3 years from now, the technologists will have a new way to get around it.
Mr. Chairman, could Mr. Gorfine respond to that as well?
Yeah, very quickly.
Yeah, if I may, one observation too is, remember, the most anonymous form of transaction is actual cash, right? People transacting cash. There's very little record of that taking place. Most virtual currencies, cryptocurrencies, are pseudonymous. So there is actually the ledger, which is a fairly transparent mechanism to be able to pursue potential law enforcement as well as AML and QIC. So I just want to point that out, but it is something that needs to be figured out by government.
So I completely understand that the number one thing government cares about is tax revenue. One of the problems is that the US tax code and most tax codes are unreasonably cumbersome, complicated, and very, very high. Not here to suggest what the government should do, but I believe that it's Congress's job to make laws simple and easy to comply with. So there is an unreasonable amount of laws centered around voluntary contracts between individuals that have absolutely no victims. And these contracts are being policed preemptively as well as post-contract. And that is unfortunate, and that is what's probably eating up the majority of tax revenue. So I guess the best analogy I can come up with is the early file sharing and music pirating of the late 1990s. It was just a lot more convenient and simpler, because when music pirating of MP3s started, it was the only way to actually get an MP3. Your only other way to listen to music was to go out and buy a CD, even if you only wanted one song. And you couldn't even listen to it on your computer, or well, you could if you put the CD in your computer, but it was harder to listen to them any way you like. And it wasn't the fact that people didn't want to pay for a song. It was the fact that pirating that song was easier, faster, quicker, more convenient, and you can work with that file going forward. Today, music pirating is in the first world is pretty rare, because the technology has simplified all of the use cases of listening to a single song, and the only advantage left is not paying for that song. But even the payment of that song has become cheap enough per song that people are willing to do it. The same concept should be applied to the tax code. If the tax code could only be simple, you will have a lot more compliance with the US tax code with the simplicity of the tax code.
Thank you, Mr. Lamalfa. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Panelists, sorry I missed part of this hearing here, but it might be, well, I'm a flip phone guy in a Bitcoin world anyhow, so I'll just, no pretense here. But Mr. Ness, I come from the flip phone part of NorCal, as you down there in the Bay Area. Just a question I'll try and narrow down to. It was talked about earlier in the committee about crypto networks and the internet protocols on tokens. So would you touch upon what it would look like if that token is determined to be a security?
Thank you, Mr. Malfa. Ms. Plaskett, 5 minutes.
Okay, so that was a very good question. So I'm going to take this back to Ethereum. And I don't know, this is a very hard question, because I don't believe the SEC has ever dealt with the situation, as mentioned earlier, of how does something was a security, not recognized as a security for years, and all of a sudden is no longer a security. Now, I believe that the SEC's understanding of the technology of Ethereum is very inaccurate. They believe that Ethereum is decentralized and therefore not subject to regulations of centralized entities. And lots of experts disagree on that. And if the SEC does not recognize the right way of thinking about it, eventually Ethereum, from a technological perspective, will be proven once again for the second or third time that it is completely centralized by a few people or a single entity known the Ethereum Foundation. Besides that, how do you go about naming something a security in hindsight? Well, it creates a problem. And I believe that what they should do is, if they do recognize that Ethereum was a security for the first 2 to 3 years of its existence, I believe that the players that are involved in bringing security need to be somehow held accountable for breaking those laws at the time, though as difficult as it may be. Perhaps you can prevent them from launching similar initiatives going forward. You can prevent them from serving on boards of any other companies or initiatives. You can prevent them from soliciting money ever again. You can prevent them from being board members of any actual companies. So there are a couple of things they can do. But Ethereum has, the SEC and the regulators have dropped the ball on Ethereum so badly that today you are facing an enormous problem on what to do about the ICOs globally. This probably would not have been a problem if this was handled back in 2015 or even 2016, or after Ethereum proved that they were centralized by returning the Ethereum tokens from something called the Dow hack and incident. So unfortunately, I do not have any good answers. Perhaps the SEC can provide some in the near future on that statement.
Good morning, gentlemen and gentlewomen. Thank you all for being here. Of course, this is something that we're all really learning about. I try and say that I'm woke, but that always doesn't work. And this is one area where I think that my 20-something-year-old children would find me really out of date. So I'm happy, Mr. Chair, that we're having this, because I think and I think you all are correct, there's a balance, right? We don't want to over-restrict something that we don't even really understand or that's still developing, but at the same time, ensuring that development, while it's developing, bad actors are not utilizing and gaming the system so that really terrible things can go on. One of the main things that I'm concerned about, people think of the Virgin Islands as really just being a beautiful paradise, but we have enormous amount of drug trafficking that goes through the Virgin Islands. And we also, along with other Caribbean islands, other islands more so than ours, have the ability to be used as a filter for hiding money, and particularly ill-gotten gains. And so I was wondering if anyone on the committee can really talk about how we can, or law enforcement can really act as a deterrent for the use of Bitcoins, the marriage now between Bitcoins and blockchain, to be able to really accelerate the use of these types of currencies in a manner that does not, cause individuals in other places to really take advantage of this. Mr. Gornfein, what do you?
So once again, you have to understand that Bitcoin will continue to be more and more popular. It will continue to be more and more anonymous. It will continue to be just better. And criminalizing people based on how much money they have is going to be a big problem for governments. And they will simply raise taxes to fight something they just can't fight. The way the drug war over the last 40 years has completely failed and cost the people of America lots and lots of money in the form of tax revenue. And when people don't want to comply with this tax revenue to police something like this, they are now being treated as bigger criminals for not complying with that tax effort. So I believe that in the future, something like Bitcoin or even cash should really reconsider what is a crime and what isn't a crime. Perhaps the best way to deal with narcotics is taking a look at other countries that have legalized narcotics, and things are a lot better. So not really here to explain why things like drugs should be legalized and regulated, and it would be a lot easier for people to comply with the taxes if the tax code was simpler. But there are other solutions than continually spending tax revenue on something that is simply not regulatable. And not sure when that will come, but just like with alcohol, eventually Congress recognized that that making alcohol illegal was not beneficial. And I believe eventually it will be recognized that many other forms of voluntary contracts on goods or acts maybe perhaps should not be policed, but perhaps regulated, and it would be a lot cheaper, and therefore there will be a lot more compliance with tax codes.
Do you think the role, we talk about law enforcement doing this, there's all of us here concerned with what is our role? What do you see CFTC in dealing with this as well? I just want to make sure.
So CFTC's, I believe that the CFTC's job, and I believe they're doing it fairly well, is to regulate the commodity markets. And as they mentioned, keep an eye on the underlying mechanisms that price those commodities and dealing with any kind of trading that involves leverage, because that could be treated as commodities. Other than that, all of the tax code questions are, I believe this is the wrong committee to ask about all of the tax information. And on a personal note, I would love to see taxes be simpler and lower so that there's a lot more simpler compliance with the tax codes.
Or that the regulations that we're doing, while we give time for this to grow, we also make sure we don't end up like Facebook, where it has outpaced us in terms of being able to do damage in the general good.
Okay, so once again, the hat will have to come off. I sincerely apologize for your candidate not winning the presidential election of 2016. However, this was not the fault of Facebook. I believe that the statements that were just made, outside of the context of this hearing, of course, are probably the biggest misunderstanding of technology. And so then the misunderstanding of the current crypto space. If you feel that the Facebook, which is a publicly traded company that anybody can invest in, that has a board, that has board members, but if you feel that Facebook is causing public harm, as a legislator, as a congresswoman, you can pass a law banning Facebook, making Facebook illegal, along with all other social media. But however, I do recommend that you start with your district making Facebook illegal there because it causes public harm, so we can see the effects of that region in a smaller, more controlled environment. I'm sorry, I should have probably let this go, but that statement bothered me more than any statement regarding the misunderstanding of Bitcoin and crypto.
Julie satisfied. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gorfin, I'm going to go right back to you. Obviously, we've talked a lot about jurisdictional issues, how to set up the proper regulatory structure that many in the industry are asking us to do. There's obviously with many of the commodities and different products, we have a SEC portion that is regulated in many cases, and then we have the CFTC, which falls under our jurisdiction. And you get to see some of the humorous anecdotes from members of Congress here, who I'm sure maybe had similar things to say when that new thing, the internet, was taking place. And how are you ever going to buy things off of the internet? Well, Jeff Bezos has showed us very well that anyone can do that now. And as cryptocurrencies continue to grow in usage, they're going to become less and less intriguing and more used. I am going to get into the demographics of many of the crypto users, but I want to ask you a quick question, sir. Based on the way current law is written, it's not cut and dry whether cryptocurrency should be regulated by the SEC or the CFTC. If Congress attempts to come up with a workable definition for cryptocurrencies that are more similar to commodities, call them, as we've heard, blockchain commodities, what should we be looking to guide us?
I believe it will be, it's impossible, and you shouldn't come up with a single definition for cryptocurrencies. As mentioned earlier, cryptocurrencies could be broken down into, I believe, 4 categories. And there are numerous cryptocurrencies that are on the edges in between the 4 categories that I described. I could have broken them down into 10 different categories. So I believe there will not be a single definition for cryptocurrencies because Bitcoin is not like the rest. It is absolutely not. You can perhaps deem ICOs into a specific category like IPOs, but even within the ICO space, like I said earlier, in the first 100 ICOs that I've deeply looked into, I found one that I believe was not in violation of anything. So there will be these fringe cases of 1 out of 100. So I don't know what the best solution will be there, but having a one regulatory name for cryptocurrencies, I believe, will be disastrous from an economic and a regulatory perspective.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, my time is about ready to expire, but we want to make sure that we devise a regulatory structure that allows this industry to continue to grow, but allows us to address many of the law enforcement problems that have been brought up here by many of my colleagues. So can't wait to continue to work with you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Yoho for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate y'all having the patience to be here. This is something that's really confusing to me. My wife and I, we watched a documentary on Bitcoins.
I really hope that documentary was Magic Money because I was in that documentary. So thank you for that, for having me in that documentary. Magic Money, check it out.
And when we got done, we were more confused, and I have not invested in any, as you asked. With that said, Mr. Gensler, in your testimony, you mentioned the recent SEC staff determination that Ether is not a security, although it might have been at its issuance. If the SEC had determined Ether was a security in 2015, what regulatory requirements would Ether be subject to today? And I've got 2 follow-ups.
Once again, I don't believe this question could be answered because I don't think that the SEC, as I mentioned earlier, I don't believe the SEC ever had to deal with this before. So I am very, very curious of what the SEC is going to do about that.
And anybody else that wants to weigh in on this?
If they had determined that way back in 2015, at the time, they would have had to give some full and fair disclosure. I think the SEC at that time would have probably said, well, it's probably not 3 years of financials and things like that because it was a new startup. And this is something the SEC is grappling with even now for current initial coin offerings. What is full and fair disclosure? I think Director Hinman at the SEC said it right. It's about information asymmetry. Give an investor enough information so they can take the risk. Government shouldn't, it's not a nanny government. We're not, but the investors can take the risk as long as they get enough information.
Okay. And how might such a regulatory regime affect the functionality of the Ethereum network? I think the important.
So I already answered this question, I believe, a couple of times. I forgot the order. I really wish I saved my earlier explanations on Ethereum being a security for this section, and I don't really want to repeat myself. But yeah, the SEC has a giant problem because these ICOs should not exist. And these ICOs probably would not exist if the SEC had done its job in 2015.
Important thing is, we don't want to stifle the imagination, the entrepreneurship, the development of this, but yet we want to have the safeguards in place. Whether it's the CFTC or the SEC, we just want to make sure that when people get involved in it, that their monies or their investment are protected. You were going to add something?
Yes. So once again, it's a delicate balance on when you are controlling what a private citizen can and can't do. And in the general crypto space, in a libertarian community, I am also seen as one for the state, and playing the nanny state, and where there should be regulations on telling people what to do. I don't really feel that the government should tell people what to do. However, in these particular cases of ICOs and investments in general, I believe it is the government's job and the regulator's job to make sure that the things people are investing in are legitimate and that the solicitation on their money from investment follows the current laws, especially the Howey test, which has been around for over 50 years, and I believe is a pretty good understanding of what is and isn't an investment contract. So while I don't believe that a person should be regulated on where they can and can't invest their money, I believe that those that are trying to solicit another person for money need to follow certain regulation. And it was a very good rule that has been around in the traditional finance space that you need some kind of statement on financials before you can offer some kind of an investment to the public. And for obvious reasons, none of these ICO projects can possibly have any kind of a statement on financials because there are no financials. These are investments in things that don't yet exist. And I believe this is a problem. And once again, I wish the SEC had thought of this problem more seriously in 2014 and 2015, even though some of us were explaining these exact things even back then.
My other question is, I sit on foreign affairs and we deal a lot with North Korea and the sanctions and all that. And we see countries changing companies, funneling money, breaking sanctions or skirting sanctions. And a lot of it we see is being done over electronic currency like this. What are the safeguards that you guys can help us with on that so that we can follow it? You know, when it's cash transfers, it's easier to track that. We can block and sanction those banks or those entities. But when they're transferring things like this or any other nefarious activity, drug deals and things like that, what are the safeguards that you guys can put in place that we know we can follow that stuff? Appreciate it.
So everything you would like could be done with pretty much every project other than Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is the only one that is technologically decentralized from its developer perspective. And there is no single entity that can put that in. All of these other projects in the crypto space are subject to regulation and they are subject to enforcement. And all of these and everything you would like could be placed into those projects by the entities that control the development of all of those other projects. Now, having said that, I would like to point out that even though there are international sanctions being placed on certain countries, I believe that if sanctions are placed on a certain country, it is the right of the citizens of that country to get around those regulations. And I also believe that it is the duty of the governments of those countries to get around those regulations for the benefit of their citizens. Now, we may not agree with the tactics and we may not agree with what is being done in those countries, and which is why we have sanctions on them in the first place. But if you do think about it from their point of view, they will use whatever means necessary to try and do what they think is right. And that is the world that we live in, and it's a world we have to deal with.
Appreciate your time. I'm out of my time, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I'll thank the panel. Mr. Gorfine, I think you may have to slip out to catch a plane, but I'd like to give each of you probably no more than a minute to kind of any closing comments, think you wish you'd have said during your opening or a question that didn't get answered. You thought of it'd be helpful for the record to have it. So, well, thank you. It's been a...
Well, let's go with screen share. So thank you so much. I really hope everyone enjoyed listening to this. I know this was a little bit long. I will continue to try and do more of these with every Senate and Congress hearing on the subject of cryptocurrencies. Perhaps I will go back and look at some of the older Congress or Senate hearings about cryptocurrencies and take a look at some of their questions then. I believe I've spoken more than enough and I've explained pretty much everything that I think about the current ICO space and the current regulatory structure. But it all starts with definitions. I believe that the more regulators and congressmen understand the different types of cryptocurrencies and crypto assets we have, the better their understanding, the better off everybody will be. So I really hope that somebody sends this to our congressmen so they can have my ideas on the subject, at which I've been around the crypto space since 2013, formerly from the traditional Wall Street environment. Once again, this is Tone Vays, and thank you so much for watching.
A terrific couple of hours. It's well spent for us. I hope you consider it the same. Clearly elucidated some issues, not only just with the regulation of these issues, but also the tangential impact of taxable transactions being captured in a way that folks can comply with our tax code and the revenues there, the law enforcement piece. Ms. Balday, I think you may be involved with a group that's trying to find a way to create a currency that is not synonymous, but would be anonymous. That's perfectly within, that's what these that's what innovators do, is they see something that needs to get changed, and they'll do that. And so that just speaks to how dynamic the process is. So as long as the stupid criminals keep using Bitcoin, will be great, but then the smart ones will pivot to something that allows them to hide better behind that. So it's been a terrific eye-opening session, and will not be the last, because our folks at the CFTC, who are our partners in making this happen, and their partners at the SEC, really want to do the same thing, and that is regulate where it needs to, and give the certainty so that the incumbents don't have to worry about asking for permission while the innovators are asking for forgiveness. That's an unlevel playing field. And we also want this action going on within the United States. So thank you all very much. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any question posed by a member. This hearing of the Committee of Agriculture is adjourned. Thank you.